The third night of December, the worst storm of the year came down the Pendower Road, and into the common room of the Trembath Arms walked a man in a wet greatcoat who would not give his name. She noticed his hands before she noticed his face. They were a gentleman's hands, ungloved and reddened by the cold, and they had set down on the worn counter a purse heavy enough to make the tallow candle's flame lean toward it. Behind that counter stood a young woman in a gray wool gown gone thin at the elbows, a ledger open before her, her fingers stained faintly green from the morning's work in the still-room. She did not look at the purse. She looked at the rain still falling from his shoulders, and thought only that the floor she had scrubbed at dawn would have to be scrubbed again. The innkeeper, a round and anxious man, was already moving toward the stranger with the particular bow he kept for quality. The stranger ignored him. He was looking at her, the woman with the ledger, and there was in his gray eyes something she could not name, a kind of careful attention that did not belong to a man who had walked in out of a storm. Around them the common room held its small noises, the spit of the fire, the knock of a tankard, the wind worrying the shutters. She felt her own breath go shallow in her throat, and did not understand why. He asked the innkeeper a question. "Lo," and the innkeeper answered it, and then the stranger reached into his coat and counted out coin onto the counter beside the ledger, more coin than she had seen in one place in 2 years. He pushed it toward her. He told her it was for the debt. He told her the debt was paid in full and there would be no more spoken of it. Then he asked her name. She did not give it to him, not that night. She would remember that for a long time afterward, that she had stood with a fortune lying on the counter, and her freedom bought by a man she had never met, and she had pressed her lips together and said nothing at all. To understand why a woman would refuse to speak her own name to the man who had just unmade the chain around her neck, you have to go back, past the storm, past the inn, to a small shop on the high street of the village of Meath, and to the man who had kept it. Her name was Rowena Tregenna, and once she had been an apothecary's daughter with clean hands and a future. Her father, Mr. Tregenna, had kept the only chemist's shop in Meath for 30 years, and he had kept it well. He had a gift for the still-room, for the drying and the steeping and the careful weighing of bitter things, and he had taught his daughter all of it because he had no son, and because he had loved her enough to think her worth teaching. She had grown up among the blue glass jars, and the smell of chamomile and the slow brown light through the bottle glass window, and she had believed, in the unthinking way of a girl who has never been hungry, that the world was orderly, and that the orderly were rewarded. The fever came to Meath in her 23rd year, and it took her father in 9 days. It did not take the debt he had not told her about. He had borrowed, in his last hard winters, against the value of his stock and his lease, and he had borrowed from the only man in the village with money to lend, which was the man who kept the coaching inn on the Pendower Road. When the burying was done, and the shop was sold to clear the larger creditors, there remained a sum still owing to the innkeeper. And Rowena Tregenna had no shop, no father, and no means by which to pay it. Quintrell the innkeeper was not a cruel man, though he was a careful one. He made her an offer that he plainly considered generous. She would come to the Trembath Arms and work in the still-room and the kitchen and the laundry in the common room, and her wage would be set against the debt, and when the debt was cleared, she would be free to go. He did not tell her how long that would take. She did the arithmetic herself, on the first night, lying on a cot in the cold room over the stables. At the wage he named, against the sum she owed, she would be free in a little above 4 years. So she had folded her 2 good gowns and her father's brass scales and a small portrait of her mother she could barely remember, and she had walked the 2 miles from the shop she had grown up in to the inn she would now belong to, and she had begun. That was the thing the season had decided about her, in the 18 months between the burying and the storm. To the carters and the postboys and the passing gentry who stopped to change horses, she with the bound girl at the Trembath Arms, the one with the strange green stains on her fingers, who did not laugh at their jokes and did not meet their eyes, and went quiet when spoken to. They did not know she had read Latin at her father's table. They did not know she could set a dislocated shoulder, or bring down a fever, or tell a true fever from a feigned one at 20 paces. They saw a thin, grey woman with downcast eyes, and they made of her what such men make of such women, which is nothing, or worse than nothing. Mrs. Quintrell, the innkeeper's wife, said it plainest one morning in the kitchen, not unkindly the way one states a fact about the weather. She told the new scullery maid not to mind Rowena, that the girl was clever with her herbs, but cold as the still-room slate, that no man would ever warm to a creature so closed and so proud, debt-bound, and dowerless as she was. Rowena heard it through the open door, her hands in the grey wash-water, and she did not stop her hands, and she did not let her face change. She had learned that much. A closed face costs nothing and gives nothing away. There was one person at the Trembath Arms who knew the truth of her, and that was Demelza Krennic, the laundry girl, 2 years younger, and a head shorter and afraid of nothing. Demelza had come to the inn the same autumn, an orphan off a failed farm at Venwick, and she had attached herself to Rowena with a loyalty that asked for no reason. It was Demelza who saved the heel of the bread for her when the kitchen ran short. It was Demelza who, when Rowena's fingers cracked and bled from the lie, slipped into the still room and stole back a little of Rowena's own self for her. They did not speak of feelings. The two of them. They spoke of work, and of the road, and of which Carter could be trusted and which could not, and in this plain currency, they loved each other. Demelza had a way of putting things. The night before the storm, sorting linen by a single rushlight, she had looked at Rowena's chapped hands and the green under her nails, and said that it was a wrong thing, a true wrong thing, that the cleverest pair of hands in the county should be spent on other people's dirty sheets. Rowena had told her to mind her work. Demelza had minded her work. The wrong thing sat in the room with them all the same. Now you understand a little of the woman behind the counter. The man who had cleared her note was not at all what he appeared, and his story is the older one. He had come up the Pendower Road that night under the name of Mr. D. Halls, and he had come on purpose, and the storm was only the season's idea, not his. His true name was Adam Wycherley, and he was the Duke of Pendower, and the whole of the country the storm was crossing was his. He had inherited it, young and unwillingly, after his elder brother died of a chill and his father of grief inside the same hard year, and he had worn the dukedom ever since like a coat cut for a larger man. He had a face the world had decided was cold, dark hair, a jaw it called carved, and gray eyes that gave away nothing because he had trained them to. He did not dance, he did not gamble. He came to the season when his aunt compelled him, and left it the moment he decently could, and the drawing-rooms had long since agreed that the Duke of Pendower was proud, unfeeling, and impossible to please. The drawing-rooms were wrong. As drawing-rooms generally are, the truth was, older and quieter than pride. 8 years before the storm, before the title fell on him, Adam Wycherley had been a younger son with a commission and no expectations, and he had been brought down off a foreign field with a French ball in his side and a fever in his blood, and he had been carried half dead and out of his senses into a wayside surgeon's care in a port town whose name he never afterward learned. He remembered almost nothing of those days with any order. He remembered heat and pain and the brass bitter taste of whatever they poured down him. And he remembered, threaded through all of it like the one clear note in a roaring fire, a pair of hands, a woman's hands, cool and certain, changing the dressing at his side, lifting his head, holding a cup to his mouth in the worst hours of the night, when the surgeon slept and the fever climbed, and Adam Wycherley believed he was dying alone among strangers. He had never seen her face. The light was always behind her. He had asked her name, more than once, in the broken hours, and each time she had only told him to be still, to drink, to breathe. And then the fever had broken, and he had been moved. And when he was well enough to ask after her, no one could tell him who she had been. A surgeon's assistant, they said. A chemist's girl who came in to help in the bad weeks. Gone now. Moved on. They did not know her name. He had carried that absence for 8 years. It had set a coldness in him that the world mistook for arrogance. He had stood up with the season's most celebrated beauties, and felt nothing, because the only woman who had ever reached the live nerve at the center of him was a pair of cool hands and a low voice in the dark. And he did not know her name, and a man cannot search a kingdom for a pair of hands. What had brought him at last to the Trembath Arms was a small thing, and a chance thing, and he would never afterward be able to say why he had followed it. His agent, going over the rents and notes of the Pendower lands, had mentioned in passing a chemist's daughter at a coaching inn, a Tregenna girl bound for her dead father's debt, clever beyond her station with simples and salves, and Adam had felt something turn over in his chest at the word chemist, at the word hands. And he had told his agent he would see to the matter himself. He had not known what he expected. He had only known that he had to go and look. So he came in out of the storm, and saw her behind the counter with her green-stained fingers and her closed gray face, and the breath went out of him, because he could not see in the candlelight whether it was her, the woman from the port town, and there was no way on earth to know it from a face he had never seen. He paid the debt because it was an injustice and he could end it. And then he asked her name because the name was the one thing he had wanted for 8 years, and had never had, and she would not give it. She would not give it, because a fortune on a counter from a stranger is not a kindness. In the world she had learned to live in, it is a transaction. And she had a hard, clear idea of what such men generally expected in return for such transactions, and her whole closed gray body had drawn in against it. She told him, in a voice so level it surprised her, that her name was her own, that the debt was the inn's affair and not his, and that she could not think why a gentleman should pay another man's note and want a serving woman's name for his trouble. She said she would speak to Mr. Quintrell about the matter in the morning. Then she closed the ledger and curtsied exactly as much as was required, and not a hair more, and went out through the kitchen door into the cold. Adam Wycherley stood a long moment by the counter with the rain drying on his coat. He had been refused a great many things in his life, and had wanted almost none of them. He found that he was for the first time in 8 years entirely awake. The next morning, the storm had blown itself out and left the world washed and bitter and bright, and the matter could not be undone, for the coin was paid, and Mr. Hulledon, Quintrell, had no intention of returning it. Rowena learned the truth of her position before breakfast. The debt was cleared. By any law of God or man, she was free to fold her 2 gowns and her father's scales and walk out the gate and never scrub another stranger's floor. And she found that she could not. She had nowhere on earth to go. The shop was sold. Her father was buried, a dowerless woman of 23 with no family. And a chemist's training the world did not want could walk out of the Trembath Arms straight into the ditch. She went to Mr. Quintrell and asked with as much steadiness as she could manage whether she might stay on at a wage now that the debt was gone. He was glad enough to keep her. She was the best worker he had. He named a wage that was barely a wage, knowing she had no other door, and she took it, because half a loaf is not starving. So the chain was off her neck, and she stayed chained to the same counter all the same. And the only thing that had truly changed was that a man in a gray greatcoat now had rooms at the inn, and showed no sign at all of moving on. He stayed a week, he called himself Mr. Halse, and let the inn believe he was a gentleman of modest means delayed by business, and he watched her. He did it without insolence, which somehow made it worse. He took his meals in the common room when she was likely to be there. He asked her gravely about the herbs drying in the still-room rafters, and found that when she forgot to be guarded, she spoke of betony and feverfew and the right way to dry a root, with a precision that no chemist's apprentice in the county could have bettered. He watched her set the carder braze wrench thumb back into its socket one afternoon with 2 sure movements and not a wasted word. And he watched the carder, who had laughed at her 100 times, go quiet and grateful and almost afraid. Adam said nothing. He only looked, and the looking grew heavier each day. And Rowena, who had spent 18 months making herself invisible, felt herself becoming visible against her will, and hated it, and could not stop a small warmth from rising in her at being for once plainly seen. It frightened her more than coldness would have. She knew what she was. She was the bound girl with the green fingers. And gentlemen did not look at such women the way this one looked at her, unless they meant her harm. She built her walls higher. She gave him short answers. She made certain never to be alone with him. And he, reading every brick of it, did not press. He only stayed and watched, and once, when she came in soaked and shivering from carrying water in the rain, he said 3 words to her in a low, even voice. He told her to sit down. He told her to come near the fire. He told her the next morning to eat. The better portion the kitchen had set aside. They were commands, plainly given, and she read them as a great lord's careless ordering of a servant, and bristled and obeyed, and did not understand that every one of them was the only language he had for tenderness, that he was a man who had learned to keep people alive by telling them to drink and breathe and be still, and that he had no other words and was too proud to learn them. You may want to tell her, watching this. You may want to say, look again. She did not look again. Not yet. The trouble that turns a small thing into a story arrived on the 4th day in a traveling chariot with the Pendower Arms on the door, and it arrived in the considerable person of the Dowager Duchess of Pendower, who was named Augustina, and who had not been deceived for one moment by a name like Hall's. She had her own people on the roads and her own reasons to watch her nephew, for she had governed the dukedom, all but name through his minority, and governed him still in everything she could reach, and she had a candidate ready for the Duchess's chair. He refused to fill. The candidate was Lady Romola Carnally, young and golden and amiable, and possessed of £40,000, and the Dowager had spent 2 seasons arranging the match the way another woman might arrange flowers, and she did not intend to see 2 seasons of work undone by a nephew gone missing on the Meredith Road. So she came after him. She swept into the Trembeth Arms in dove-grey silk and a fortune in diamonds, and made the common room feel suddenly small and shabby. And she found her nephew the Duke taking his ease at a plank table in a coaching inn, and she found serving the table a thin grey woman with stained fingers and a closed face. And the Dowager Duchess understood the whole situation in a single glance. She was not, whatever else she was, a fool. She did not make a scene. She was far too well-bred for a scene. She sat and took chocolate and observed, and within the hour she had drawn the whole history out of Mr. Quintrell as easily as drawing a cork. The dead apothecary, the debt, the stranger who had paid it, the girl who stayed. The Dowager arranged the facts in her mind into the only shape they could possibly have, which was a shape she had seen 100 times, the shape of a clever, penniless woman setting a snare for a rich and lonely man. That the man was her nephew, and the snare, baited with green-stained fingers, only made it the more dangerous, for she knew his oddness, knew there was some old foolishness in him about a nurse and a fever, and she saw with cold clarity how a sly chemist's daughter might have heard the story and built herself into it. That evening, finding Rowena alone for a moment in the passage by the still room, the Dowager Duchess delivered her first verdict, quietly, the way one delivers a thing one considers beyond argument. She told the girl that she saw exactly what she was, a grasping creature, a counterjumper's daughter, with an eye to a coronet she had no more business near than the scullery cat. She advised her with terrible politeness to be sensible to take a sum of money that would be offered, and to remove herself from the road before she came to harm she had brought on herself. Rowena stood very still in the cold passage, and said nothing at all, and the Dowager mistook the silence for cunning, where it was only the old armor coming down, and swept away satisfied that she had been understood. What the Dowager did not know, because Rowena had told no one, was that the story Augustina thought a clever girl had stolen was Rowena's own, for Rowena Tregenna had recognized the man called Halls on the 2nd day. Not his face. She had never seen his face. She had recognized his voice, low and level, telling her to sit down, telling her to be still, and the recognition had gone through her like cold water, because 8 years before, in a stinking surgeon's room in the port of Falmouth, where her father had sent her to learn dressing of wounds from a Navy man he trusted, a half-dead young officer had said 3 words to her in that exact low voice. He had said, "Do not go," She had been 17. She had sat the worst nights with him because the surgeon was old and slept, and she had changed the packing on the wound in his side and held his head and put the cup to his mouth and told him to be still, to drink, to breathe. And she had never told him her name because she was a chemist's daughter doing a chemist's work, and it was not her place to be named. He had lived. He had been carried away to a transport one gray morning while she was sleeping, and she had never known what became of him. And she had folded the memory away the way you fold away a thing, too good to be true, and she had never spoken of it to a living soul. She knew. Now, who Mr. Halls was, she had known for days. And she could not say it, because to say it was to claim a duke, and a bound girl who claims a duke is a fortune hunter by the only definition the world keeps, and the Dowager Duchess of Pendower had just told her so to her face. So she carried the knowledge alone, and served the chocolate, and kept her closed gray face. And at night, in the cold room over the stables, she pressed her hands to her own face, and felt for the first time in 18 months something she had no business feeling, and could not afford. The Dowager did not rely on advice alone. She was a woman who, having seen a danger, secured herself against it thoroughly. And here is where the matter turned hard. Within 2 days a solicitor arrived from town, a smooth gray man named Harrowby, who did the Pendower family's quieter work, and the Dowager set him to building the proof of what she already believed. He was to find the marriage settlement she had drawn between her nephew and Lady Romola the previous spring, and have it ready, half signed already by the Carnelli side, so that the Duke might be reminded of an obligation he had as good as entered. And he was to find, or to make, the evidence that the Tregenna girl was exactly the adventuress the Dowager named her. Harrowby was a thorough man. He went to Meredith. He turned over the dead apothecary's papers that the creditors had not burned, and he found among them the thing the Dowager wanted, or something that could be made to look like it. He found an old letter in the father's hand, written years before to a Navy surgeon at Falmouth, arranging for the daughter to be taught there. To Harrowby's eye, and to the Dowager's, the letter proved that the girl had been at Falmouth in the very year and the very place the Duke's foolish fever story belonged, and that proved, past any doubt they cared to entertain, that she had known the story all along and woven herself into it on purpose. The very truth of her became, in their hands, the proof of her guilt. The Dowager took the letter and locked it in her traveling desk, and felt the matter was as good as won. Lady Romola Carnley arrived on the 6th day, summoned by the Dowager, golden and bewildered and not unkind, brought to the wretched inn to remind the Duke, by her presence, of what he owed. And it was in the common room before the whole house that the dismissive verdict was spoken for the second time, and loudest. The Dowager, seating Lady Romola with great ceremony at the best table, looked across the room to where Rowena stood with a tray and said, in a voice pitched for the room to hear, that one must forgive the poor service of such places, that the creature serving them was the local debt girl, a chemist's leavings, dowerless and forward and lately grown above herself, and that it was a mercy someone would soon take her in hand. Lady Romola flushed and looked at her gloves. The Carters looked at the fire, and Rowena set down the tray without a tremor, and curtsied and crossed the room with her back straight as her father had taught her. And only Demelza, by the door, saw that her friend's hands were shaking when she reached the safety of the passage. Adam Wycherley had heard it too. He had said nothing. He had only gone very still, and the stillness was not the stillness of a man who does not care. That night Demelza found Rowena in the still room in the dark, and held her, and Rowena let herself be held. And then she told Demelza the one thing she had told no one. She told her about Falmouth, and the wounded officer, and the 3 words, and the voice she had heard again in the common room of the Trembath Arms. Demelza did not gasp or weep or any of the things a softer girl might have done. She sat with it a moment in the dark. Then she said the plainest thing, which was that if it was true, then Rowena was the one person alive who could prove it, and the proving was the only thing that would put the Dowager Duchess in her place. Rowena said she could prove nothing. A nurse leaves no record. A pair of hands signs no name. Demelza thought about that too. Then she asked whether the officer had left nothing behind in those weeks. Nothing at all. And Lowena, who had not let herself remember it fully in 8 years, went still, because he had. He had given her something on the last clear night before the fever turned. Pressed into her palm with a strength she had not known he still had, a thing she had kept and never looked at, because looking hurt. A regimental button, plain pewter, stamped with the number of his company. The only thing the young officer had owned that was his, to give. She had it, still wrapped in a scrap of flannel at the bottom of her box, 2 miles up the road in the cold room over the stables. The dark moment came the next day, and it came because the truth, half told, made everything worse before it made anything better. Adam Wycherley, who had heard his aunt's verdict in the common room and watched the woman take it without flinching, had reached the end of his long patience. He found Lowena in the inn yard at dusk, drawing water, and he did the one thing he had never let himself do, which was to ask her plainly. He told her he believed he had known her once. He told her about Falmouth, about the fever, about the hands and the voice, about 8 years of not knowing a name. He told her his voice rougher than she had ever heard it, that he thought she was that woman and that if she was, she had only to say so, and he would set the whole world right. And Lowena, with the dowager's verdict still ringing in her, with Harrowby's locked desk and Lady Romola's golden bewilderment, and the whole machinery of his world arrayed to call her a liar and a fortune hunter, the instant she opened her mouth, did the bravest and most ruinous thing she could have done. She refused to claim it. She told him he was mistaken. She told him she had never been to Falmouth in her life, that he had taken a serving woman's face and dressed it in a sick man's dream, and that he should go back to his own people and his own affairs, and trouble her no more. She said it to protect him, and to protect herself, and because she could not bear to be called an adventuress by his own aunt, and then prove the woman right by claiming him. She lied to him in the cold inn yard with the bucket between them, and she watched the small live light she had seen in his gray eyes go out, and she went inside and was sick with what she had done. She had told herself it was the only honest thing. She knew, scrubbing the cold flagstones that night with her tears falling into the gray water, that it was the worst lie of her life. Adam left the inn the next morning. He gave it out that his business was concluded, and he went. And the Dowager Duchess, watching the traveling chariot turn onto the Pentower Road with her nephew in it, and Lady Romola's hand all but secured, allowed herself the small smile of a woman whose long work has come right. The proof in her desk would never need to be used. The girl had refused him to his face. The danger had refused itself, out of existence. There remained only to settle the match. For 3 days the Trembeth Arms was as it had been, and worse, because now Lowena knew exactly what she had thrown into the inn-yard well. She did her work. She kept her face. And inside that careful stillness something had broken that she did not think would mend. She had been seen, truly seen, by the one man who had ever managed it, and she had told him he had imagined her. She thought she had done the only thing the world allowed. She had not yet understood that the world's permission is not the same as the truth, and that a woman who will not claim her own worth leaves the field to those who deny it. It was Demelza who would not let it lie, and it was Demelza in the end who set the thing in motion, because Demelza was afraid of nothing and could not bear a wrong. She did 2 things in those 3 days. She went on her 1/2 day the 2 miles up the road and the 2 miles back, and she came to Lowena in the still room and put into her hands the scrap of flannel from the bottom of the box, and she made her open it, and the plain pewter button lay in Lowena's palm with the number of the company stamped clear upon it after 8 years in the dark. And then Demelza did the second thing, the bolder thing, which she did not tell Lowena about until it was done. She had learned from the talk of the postboys where the Pendower lands lay and where the great house stood, a day's ride off. She could not ride, she could write. Just in a laboring hand, her father had beaten into her before the farm failed. So she wrote, badly and truly, the whole of it. The Falmouth story as Lowena had told it in the dark, the voice recognized, The button kept the lie told in the yard to keep from being called an adventuress, and she found a carrier going toward Pendower, and she paid him with the only coin she had, which was the silver thimble that had been her dead mother's. And she sent the letter to the Duke. Now the proof existed, and the proof was guarded, for the Dowager Duchess had not left the field. Word of a letter come to the great house from a laundry girl at a coaching inn reached Augustina before it reached her nephew, because she had set her people to watch exactly such things. She had the letter intercepted, she read it, and she understood, with a cold lurch, that the danger had not refused itself out of existence at all, that the girl was the woman after all, that the foolish fever story was true, and that if her nephew ever learned it, he would marry a chemist's daughter, and her 2 seasons of work would be ashes. So she did the last hard thing. She did not destroy the letter, for she was a careful woman, and a careful woman keeps her enemy's hand where she can see it. She locked it in the traveling desk with the Falmouth letter, and the half-signed settlement, the 3 papers together, the whole machinery of the lie and the whole proof of the truth in one place, and she resolved to bring the matter to its end at Pendower Hall, on her own ground, where she could control who spoke and who was believed. She sent word to the inn. The Duke, she let it be known, would announce his engagement to Lady Romola Carnally at a gathering at the Hall in 3 days' time, and the gentry of the county were bid to come and witness it. It was the wrong move. It was the move of a confident person, which is the only kind of move that loses. For, in summoning the county to witness her triumph, the Dowager Duchess made a public arena, and a public arena was the one ground on which the truth, once it stood up, could not be quietly smothered. How Rowena Tregenna came to be at Pendower Hall on the night of the engagement is owed entirely to Demelza Krennic, and to an old stableman named Trefusis, who had served the inn 40 years and despised the dowager on sight, and had a cousin among the Pendower grooms. Between them they got Rowena into a borrowed gown, plain dove-colored wool that had been Demelza's mother's best and was clean and whole, and into the back of a carrier's cart, and through the servants' gate of Pendower Hall on the strength of the cousin's word, on the night the county came to watch a duke throw himself away on £40,000. Rowena had the pewter button wrapped in flannel in her hand. She did not have a plan. She had only the thing Demelza had said to her in the dark, which was that she was the one person alive who could prove it, and that to stay silent now was not modesty, but cowardice, and that her father had not taught a brave woman to die a coward in a still-room. The great hall of Pendower blazed with light, and into it Adam Wycherley walked at the appointed hour to do the thing his aunt had arranged, because he was tired, and because the woman who might have stopped him had told him to his face that he had dreamed her. And a man can only hold out so long against the whole weight of his world, telling him what he must do. He had not slept since the inn-yard. He stood at the head of the room with Lady Romola, golden and gentle at his side, and his aunt triumphant in diamonds, and he prepared to announce a marriage he did not want, and his grey eyes were the eyes of a man going under for the last time. The Dowager Duchess rose to speak the words that would begin it, and it was then, in the held-breath hush of the great bright room, with the whole county watching, that a thin woman, in a borrowed dove-grey gown, stepped out from beside a pillar where Trefusis's cousin had set her, and crossed the long floor with her back straight as her father had taught her, and stopped before the Duke of Pendower, and at last did the thing she had refused to do on the night of the storm. She gave him her name. She said it plainly into the silence that she was Rowena Tregenna, daughter of the apothecary of Meath, and that 8 years before, at Falmouth, in a navy surgeon's room, she had sat the worst nights with a wounded officer who had asked her name 3 times and never had it, and that the officer had given her on his last clear night, the only thing he owned. And she opened her hand and held out the plain pewter button, with the number of his company stamped upon it, and across that bright and crowded room the Duke of Pendower looked at it, and the carved, cold face that the world had so long mistaken for pride broke open like ice over a river in the thaw. He came down the length of the room to her. He did not hurry. Every eye in the county followed him. He stopped before the thin woman in the borrowed gown, and he took the button from her open hand, and he turned it once in his fingers. And he knew it, for he had given it, and he had thought of it 10,000 times in 8 years. And then the Duke of Pendower spoke the single short sentence he had carried unspoken for 8 years, in the same arena where his aunt had meant to dispose of him, loud enough for the whole county to hear and never to forget. He said, "This is the woman I will marry." The Dowager Duchess of Pendower did the only thing left to a person whose script has worked everywhere, except here. She fought. She would not be undone in her own great hall by a chemist's daughter and a pewter button, and her composure cracked toward the sharp false brightness of a clever woman who feels the ground tilt. She said it was a trick. She said the girl was the very adventuress she had warned them all of, a counter-jumper who had heard a foolish old story and bought a soldier's button at a fair and rehearsed the scene to snare a coronet. She turned to the room and named the danger she had seen. And for one cold moment the room wavered, because the Dowager Duchess was the Dowager Duchess, and the woman before them was dressed in borrowed wool. And then Augustina, sure of her ground, certain the proof of her own case lay safe in her traveling desk, made the error that confident people make. To crush the lie, she had to produce the truth she had hidden, and she sent for her desk and had it brought, and unlocked it before them all to show the county the proof of the creature's scheming. She drew out the Falmouth letter, the dead apothecary's own hand, and held it up, and named it as the proof that the girl had known to be at Falmouth in that year and that place, the very proof of the fraud. And Rowena Tregenna looked at the letter in the great lady's hand and answered in her father's clear, Latin-trained voice that the letter said no such thing, that it was her father arranging her training under a Navy surgeon, that it proved only that she had truly been where she said she had been, and that a letter cannot at once prove a woman was at Falmouth and prove she only pretended to have been. The room saw it. The room was not a fool, even when the Dowager was. A murmur went through the county like wind through standing corn. And then the solicitor Harrowby, that smooth, gray, careful man, did the thing the niche's moral weather always at last allows, for he was an honest man, bent to dishonest work, and he had reached the edge of what he would do. With the whole county watching, and the truth half out of the bag, he would not perjure himself before them all to seal a fraud. He stepped forward, and from the same desk he drew the third paper, the laundry girl's letter, the one the Dowager had intercepted and hidden, and he laid it open, and he said quietly that her grace had been in possession of this some days, and that it told the same tale the young woman told, written by another hand before this night. When no scene could have been rehearsed, the Dowager's case died there, in the open desk, killed by the very proof she had hoarded. Augustina, Dowager Duchess of Pendower, stood among her diamonds in her own great hall and understood, all at once, and far too late, that she had been wrong, not wickedly wrong, but confidently wrong, that the order she had spent her life protecting had never once been able to measure the worth of the thin woman in the borrowed gown, and that her nephew had seen what she could not. The sharpness went out of her. She did not weep, for she was past the age of weeping in public, and the room watching the great lady's composure fragment felt no triumph, only the strange, grave quiet of seeing a strong, wrong thing corrected at last. She was not destroyed. She was not driven out. She was displaced, gently and completely, from the center of a story she had thought was hers to write, and she sat down in a chair that someone brought, and was for the first time in her long life an old woman at the edge of a room. Lady Romola Carnelli, golden and amiable and never cruel, did the kind thing which surprised no one who had truly looked at her. She crossed to the thin woman in dove-gray before the whole county, and she took Rowena's stained hands in her gloved ones, and she said that she was glad, truly glad, to be released from a match neither she nor the Duke had ever wanted, and that she hoped they would let her come to the wedding. And the county, which is only ever the crowd, and the crowd in this niche is sound when at last it is allowed to see, gave its verdict by warming all at once to the apothecary's daughter, who had crossed a hostile floor with her back straight and proved her worth out of her own open hand. The coda of all this is quiet, as the warm things are, and it belongs to a small room and not a great one. They were married in the spring, in the parish church at Meredith, where her father lay, and it was a plain wedding by a duke's measure, and a very grand one by the villages. And Demelza Cranach stood up with the bride in a new gown that was the first new gown of her life, and the silver thimble she had spent on a carrier's fee came back to her tenfold, and then some, though it was the standing up she cared for, and not the gowns. Old Trefusis was given the keeping of the Pendower stables, and grumbled happily at the grooms, until the day he died. The Dowager Duchess came to live out her years in the Dower House at the edge of the park, and was visited there, and was treated by the new Duchess with a courtesy so complete and so unrevenging that the old woman, in her last years, came almost to love the chemist's daughter she had tried to drive into the ditch, which is a stranger and better ending than punishment. And Rowena Wycherley, who had been the bound girl at the Trembath Arms with the green stains on her fingers, kept a still room at Pendower Hall to the end of her days, because a duchess may do as she pleases, and what pleased her was the smell of chamomile and feverfew, and the slow brown light through the bottle glass jars, the things her father had taught her with his own clean hands. On the long winter evenings, she and Adam sat by the fire, and he was not a talkative man, and never became one, and he did not need to be, for the live light that the world had thought was missing from his gray eyes had only ever been waiting for one thing, and it had found it. On a shelf in that still room, in a small dish of plain blue glass, she kept a button, plain pewter, stamped with a number of a company, worn smooth at the edges by 8 years in the dark, and a lifetime of being turned over by 2 pairs of hands that had at last learned each other's names. He had asked for her name once in a coaching inn, in a storm, and she had refused him. She had given it to him in the end in front of the whole world. And every winter night, when she set the button back in its blue dish, and the fire settled and the snow came down soft on the Pendower Park, she thought that the asking and the giving had been worth all the cold years between them. And the man beside her, watching her hands, thought the same, because by then they no longer had to. If Lowena's long journey from the cold counter to the warm fire has stayed with you, sit a moment with it before you go, and remember the woman who crossed the floor,